Hello everyone, my name is Jeff Neville and welcome to Selective Imagery. Welcome to Thanks for the Memories, Part 14. The 1914 Kodak number 3-A folding camera and the Minolta 1958 SR2 35mm SLR. Hello everyone, this is Jeff Neville for Selective Imagery, and thank you very much for joining us for another episode of Thanks for the Memories. This time we're going to talk about two cameras. We're going to talk about the 1914 Kodak 3-A folding camera. And then we're going to talk about the 1958 SR2 Minolta 35mm SLR, which was the first SLR camera Minolta ever made. So we'll start with the Kodak first. So I will reach down and grab this, and as you can see, it's fairly large. Now, I wasn't really looking to add this camera to my collection, but when I saw it, it was just impeccable in terms of the quality for its era. I mean, I've never seen a camera from 1914 that looked as good as this one. So this camera is 110 years old, plus 111 years old, soon to be, right? But anyway, this is what would be the front view. Okay, this will drop down, and the bellows will come out. It's a folding bellows camera. This is the rear view. You have these tangs here, these releases here that allow me to pop the back off, which I'll do. Then the rear view, basically you just have a tripod socket in the center. And the top view, you have another way, depending on how you're photographing, to basically use that as a viewfinder. And normally these black enamel painted finishes, this body is aluminum with a fine grain leatherette, fine grain leather on it, and normally this black enamel paint is always chipped, and the glass in it looks horrible. And this thing is exceptional. It's better than museum quality, in my opinion. So we'll start by just pinching and removing the back. Okay. So this is your frame advance on the top. So it's your take-up spool over here. And then you would put your film over on this side. They print, you're not going to see it from here, but they print all the patent information, and what I'll do is I'll take a still photograph of this and embed it in the video so you can see the patent information. Here is the back plate. You can see the patent information, the last date being June 16th of 1914. As I'm talking here about it. So the last patent on this camera was from 1914. and they stopped making this camera in 1915. So this is either a 1914 model or a 1915 model. And to open it up, you lift up on this metal piece on the front, which acts as a stand, and you pull on it to release it, and you lower the platform and it locks in place. So now you can see, the guts of the camera. Now I'm going to pull out, squeeze some levers to pull out the bellows and unravel the shutter release cable here while I do this. And now you can see what this camera looks like. So this camera originated in 1903, continued to about 1915, and like I said, it was made of aluminum and with fine grain leather, with a nice leather handle. Came with a beautiful case, leather case. Unfortunately, I don't have the key for it, so I can't lock it. And I really purchased this just because of the near perfect appearance of this camera for its era. It was classified as a folding bed camera type. It made exposures in 3 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch postcard size is what it was referred to, using 122 type roll film, and the Kodak 122 roll film was introduced when this camera came out in 1903. You could get the film in 4, 6, or 10 exposure lengths. The film was discontinued in 1971. Now you could still go online and find some of this film, but obviously it's going to be very much so outdated film, so you really don't know what results you're going to get. So there were 7 variants of this model. The early one being rather expensive, using a Kodak automatic shutter and a rapid rectangular lens made by Bosch and Lomb. Later models such as this one were more moderately priced versions with a ball bearing shutter, which was a multi-blade leaf shutter. One exception was there was a Zeiss Kodak and a stagment lens corrected for spherical aberration, coma, and astigmatism, which of course really jolted up the price quite a bit. And now both shutters could be released via either a lever, which you have right here, or a shutter release cable. Well, this newer model, 1914 being newer, okay, the shutter release cable works, but on the earlier models you didn't have a shutter release cable per se. You had the old pneumatic squeeze bulb type to actuate the lever mechanism. Now this camera had red bellows until 1912 when they switched to black. I really don't know why they did that. I'm making an assumption here that the black dye might have been cheaper than the red dye, and obviously the camera would be a little less conspicuous being black rather than standing out with the red bellows, but that's just my guess. I'm sure it had something to do with costs. Red was not a real common bellows color, obviously. So let's just go over, the camera a little bit. So obviously, just as a typical fold out, you have a set of rails that you pull out the bellows, okay? And normally when you're taking a shot, in this case you would lift up. This is a chrome cover. It protects the glass here that you're normally looking down on. Okay, you're shooting looking down. You have a lens in the front. The image comes through, hits a mirror, it's reflected up to the glass that you're looking down on. And what's nice is if you want to shoot in this direction, you have two choices. Okay, you could just rotate this and still look down on it and take your image, or you could decide to use this viewfinder instead and take the image. So you have a choice. Just trying to get this thing closed here, okay? Now you're at the bottom of the lens, and I'm going to take pictures of this so I could point it out and talk, but on the bottom you just have a lever to slide back and forth to adjust your f-stop. And your f-stop range, believe it or not, is f4 to f128. Your shutter is up here, your shutter adjustment is up here, and you just move this lever to whatever position you want. Now your choices are time mode, bulb mode, and you have 1/25th, 1/50th, and 1/100th of a second. And that's it. Here's a better view of the f-stop ranges for, like I said, the 128 and the shutter adjustment. Now on this part of the camera, above my finger, you have a distance scale, and on this distance scale you have like little it's a metal plate, and it has little punch outs in it, and these punch outs are aligned with different increments in feet or meters. So if I'm measuring feet, you have 6, 8, 10, 12, 15, 25, 50, and 100-foot increments. There's a little release mechanism here that's spring-loaded, and there's a bar that you could slide it back and forth, and it has a piece that actually goes into one of those square cutouts. And what you do is you lift this up, you slide it, and you engage it into one of those cutouts, and what that does is when you're sliding out your bellows, it acts as a stop. And then you take this knob and you tighten it so that it can't move, and that's how you can preset your distances. And then basically once you determine your shutter speed that you want to use and your f-stop, then you just take a picture. Simple as that. So here's that close-up image of the plate, and you can see distance in feet or meters. You can see the rod, and here I'm lifting up the mechanism that sits in the cutouts, and you just drop it into whatever foot indicator you want to use. But this is a wonderful conditioned unit camera from 1914/1915 time frame. And that's about it for this particular camera. Definitely something I'm very, very pleased that I bought, even though it wasn't in the plan. But the price was reasonable, and it's just great to have it. Okay, so here I am now with camera number 2, the 1958 Minolta SR2 35mm camera. And here's what it looks like. The front view and the top view. And once again, I will take some images of this, still images, to embed in the video. Bottom view. rear view. And we'll start with a little discussion before I just go over and identify everything that's on this camera. This is the SR2. Now I know what you're thinking. Well, why is the first 35mm camera from Minolta called the SR2? I don't know. I guess you'd have to ask somebody why they did that. You would think an SR1 would come out first, would you not? But not in this case. This was introduced in 1958. Give me a second here. And the SR1 came out in 1959. And the SR3 followed in 1960. Now, when I was younger, I always thought I had one of the first Minolta SLRs, which was the SRT 101, but that was incorrect because that camera actually didn't come out until 1966 when I was 7 years old. And the SRT 100, once again, they fooled around with the numbering. The SRT 101 came out before the SRT 100. And the SRT 100 was a dumbed down version of the SRT 101. And that camera didn't come out until 1971. And like the SR1 camera that superseded this, it only had 1/500th of a second shutter speed, while the SR2 and the SRT 101 had 1/1000th of a second shutter speed. So the second camera that came out in these certain styles of Minolta cameras were actually dumbed down versions of the previous camera. And being a big fan of Minolta for a long time, having several of their cameras when I grew up, because they were basically considered an amateur photographer's camera, and they were priced accordingly. Although we all know that Minolta had a lot of firsts in the camera technology department, which then also got put into Canon cameras or Nikon cameras. But Minolta did have a lot of firsts, but I'm not going to go into all those things. But we all know that that's true. Now I wanted to get the first SLR from Minolta, so I researched and I looked, and I really couldn't find any that were available in the United States. Okay, you could find a handful of these in Japan, but they were very expensive, and they were not necessarily in the condition that they would try to advertise it at. They were not in the best condition. So eventually, I did find one of these, and they are classified as somewhat rare. I found one in the United States, and as a collector, you're always trying to find the best condition camera. You want to try to find one that's in working order, if at all possible, and obviously within your price point, what you're willing to pay for it. And let's just say, just like with comic books, okay, or anything else, what a camera may be worth is it's only worth what somebody is willing to pay for it. Let's put it that way. Now, this one is in what I would consider very good to excellent condition. It has very few scratches on it. It has a few little marks on it, and there is a slight depression. I wouldn't call it a dent per se, but there is a slight depression in the front pentaprism up here. But other than that, I mean, functionally it's in superb condition, and the lens is in great working order. Maybe has some cleaning marks, a few light scratches, cleaning marks on the lens, nothing that would affect your ability to take a good image with it. Now let's see. A little history before we get into the features on the camera. Minolta was founded by Mr. Kazuo Tashima, and when he created this first design, he really wanted it to be like an artistic camera. And like I said, I'll take images of this, stills, but it had like a stepped platform on it. You can see it mostly from the back, how it has like this little shelf, and to a lesser extent on the front. And it really is a wonderfully styled camera. It's not overly heavy, but it's not, it is solid. It is solidly built. And personally, I think that this style, or slight variance from it, basically held up right to their last fully mechanical SLR, which was the SRT 202 in 1975. And this camera was followed up after a number of SR series cameras by the Minolta SRT series, and I'll put them side by side. This body is a little bit deeper. It has a little bit more rounding around the edges, whereas the SRT 100 is more squarish. So I really do think that the appearance, in my opinion, of the SR2, I like it a little bit more than the SRT series. And I own an SRT 101. This camera was gifted to me by my neighbor, SRT 100. And I've talked about this before, getting it CLA'd and fully functional and whatnot. So that was the goal with that camera, and that's why I didn't go out and buy an SRT 101, because I don't need every Minolta camera ever made. Now this camera was interesting. This camera was introduced in Japan before the Nikon F was introduced and the Canon Flex, and Minolta had originally announced that this camera was going to have a motor drive. Now that never happened, and one of the reasons that did not happen was because the Nikon F had come out with a very advanced motor drive in comparison to the design that Minolta originally was going to use on this particular camera, and it was nowhere near as good, and so they never introduced it. So the Nikon F was the first 35mm SLR that had a motor drive. Now the funny thing is, in the United States, this Minolta SR2, along with the Nikon F and the Canon Flex, were introduced at the same time at a Philadelphia photo show in the March of 1959. The SR2 with a 55mm f1.8 bayonet mount lens, and it is a radioactive lens, so I've been holding this for a while and had it in my lap, so I probably won't be able to have any more kids, but I'm done with that anyway. Joking, I don't think it's that bad. But this was $249.50 when it came out. The Canon Flex that had a 50mm f2 lens was actually more money. Okay, that one came out for $299.95, and the Nikon F with the 50mm f2 lens came out for $359.50. So back in those days, you know, like I said, Minolta was more of a budget camera. It was more expensive than, let's say, an Aside Pentax was, but it was cheaper than the Canons, and which were then cheaper than the Nikons. Now nowadays everything's moved around. Minolta no longer exists. They got Sony, but Canon cameras are now really the most expensive cameras out there. Probably followed closely by Sony, and then Nikon is actually a not cheap by any means, but a lower price point than that. Now the top plate of the camera over in this corner has the inscription on it of the words Chiyoda Kogaku, and that was the company name. Okay, you may have Minolta on the Pentaprism. That's basically the brand of the camera, but the company itself was called Chiyoda Kogaku from 1937 to 1962. Now, Minolta Camera Company eventually became the official name of the Minolta cameras. Now, different sources have different dates. Multiple sources say that occurred in 1962. Others said it did not happen until 1966. So I'm not 100% sure which date is correct. I tend to lean more towards the 1962 date, but that's that's just my opinion. Now, one thing that Minolta was proud of was the brightness of the viewfinder screen in this camera. It said it had the world's brightest viewing system, and it was brighter than the early Nikon F bodies, but it had no Fresnel screen lines on it at all. It just had ground glass central focusing area, and that's what was on this camera. Now eventually they did come out with the split image screen, but obviously they were not user replaceable. Okay, this did not have a pentaprism where you could remove the top and change different focusing screens, which you were eventually able to do as the Nikon F camera evolved. Now, let's just, I guess before I go any more into just talking here, let's just kind of go over the features. So you have a lens release here. You push it down and the lens comes off. Bayonet mount. Okay. Line up the dots. You have a self timer. I'm going to advance and cock the shutter, and I'm going to move the self timer. Works fine. So the only thing you have on the front is the lens release lever, a self timer, and then you have your flash sinks on the side. You have two different connection points. One's labeled FP for FP style flash bulbs, flash bulb type of unit, and then you have the X sync for your electronic flash, and we'll get into that a little bit more later on. And so that's all you have on the front. If you look at we'll look at the back here before we go to the top. The back basically just has this manually rotating dial where you can line up your film speed with an indicator line. It's just like a reminder so that you know what film you have in the camera, what ASA you have in the camera. If you go to the top, you have your standard rewind crank for your film over here. You have a magnified, really nice magnified bubble like you'd have on a Leica for looking at your how many shots you've taken, your frame counter. You have a shutter speed dial, and what's interesting about this is with this shutter speed dial, you have to lift the collar to rotate to any shutter speed selector. So it's always locked. You can't accidentally change it. You have to lift it and turn it. And then you have a shutter release button surrounded by the film actuating lever. When you look at the bottom, you have the small button that you would push when you have completed shooting pictures and you need to rewind the film. You push that button before you turn the crank and rewind the film. You have your tripod socket, and then you have a piece of black plastic here with a hole in the middle, and that is presumed to be where, like I don't know, just a place to guide the motor drive that was going to be on this camera that never got released, and that's what that little plastic insert is for. Obviously never got used. And I'll open up the back by lifting up the rewind knob. And cloth shutter. And that's about it. And I'll advance the lever here. You can hear the shutter. All the shutter speeds work fine. It's in perfect working order. So here are some close-up images, front view. You can see the self-timer, and you can see this little nub on the right-hand side of the lens. We'll talk about that later. Top view, rewind, frame counter, shutter speed dial, film advance mechanism, and you can see the lens markings. This is a close-up of the lens markings, which is important because those yellow numbers towards the body of the lens are actually important. They're called light value scale, and we will get into a discussion about that later on in the video. And here's the bottom view. Okay, the rewind release button and the tripod socket. And here's with the back open. And you can just see it's got a cloth shutter curtain and nothing overly exciting. Now we'll just do a little bit of general conversation here. The SR2 did have an instant return mirror. Minolta was the third Japanese manufacturer to develop that and have that in their cameras. The first two was Asahi Pentax and a company called Zunow. Z-U-N-O-W, who I'd never heard of before. The camera does not have a depth of field button. You're used to seeing on other Minolta cameras, like this SRT 100, you had this depth of field preview button so that you could stop down the lens to see what your depth of field was. This camera did not have that button. Now, it has no metering system, which was typical of the era. It has no mirror lockup capability. Now, what's different with this, the aperture is not fully open until you advance the film. Then the aperture opens up all the way. and we'll talk about that more in a second. I take the picture, the aperture is going to be whatever the aperture ring is set for. And what's interesting with the aperture ring is it doesn't have click stops. It does have detents, but it has this little push-in tang on the side of the lens right here. And you have to push that in with your finger in order to rotate the aperture ring. And as you let go of it, it will click into, whatever f-stop you want to use. But it's not like what you're used to seeing on later models where you just had these, you would just turn it and you'd have an indent and you could freely turn it through the range. This, you have to push this little tang, I guess that's the best way to talk about it. You have to push that in order to rotate your f-stops. The focusing is extremely well dampened, very, very smooth. I don't have any problem focusing with it. I would have preferred, the split range, split center portion on the focusing screen, split microprism, but just has the ground glass, so it does make it a little harder to focus, but it's not that bad. And so if you don't advance the film after you take a picture, you can look at your depth of field, because if you're looking through the viewfinder and you adjust your aperture, you're going to be able to see your depth of field. You're going to be able to see the changes. So it doesn't have a depth of field preview button, but as long as you're fooling around with your aperture looking through the viewfinder before you move the film advance lever, you can look at what your depth of field would be at a given f-stop. The self-timer is 10 seconds, which is typical. And we don't know how many these cameras. It wasn't a common camera. I haven't been able to find out how many were made. I don't know if I'll be able to track the serial number on this to find out, if where this sits in the production run. I really don't know if I'll be able to figure that out. Now, many say that the Minolta had an auto diaphragm, which is really not correct based on today's definition, but what was called automatic in 1958 would now be called semi-automatic in today's terms. In a Minolta ad, it said, "The world's first system where lens automation is directly synchronized with the rapid film advance lever." Okay, advance the film wind lever. The diaphragm lens opens to its largest aperture. The film advances. Your shutter is cocked and the frame is counted, and you're ready to take your picture. The lens stops down automatically to the pre-selected aperture, but did not open again until the film was advanced. Because the user didn't have to manually reopen the aperture, this was considered an automatic diaphragm. But nowadays, what's considered automatic is your lens is wide open as you're focusing, and then as you hit the shutter button, the lens stops down, it takes the exposure, and then the lens opens up again. So that's what's really considered fully automatic by today's standards. So this was really a semi-automatic, but that's not how it was described back in 1958. So they did not have the feature to be what was considered fully automatic until 1961 era, when the SR1 model came out. 1962 version of the SR1 camera came out. So this original feature on this camera was called a auto preset diaphragm. Now, when you think about it, on a lot of other cameras, when you wanted the focus to have a bright enough image when you look through the viewfinder, you would open up the lens to the widest f-stop. Okay, so that you could focus. And then you would stop down the lens accordingly to what you wanted it to be and set your shutter speed, and you would take the image. So what they were touting with this camera is, well, I don't have to adjust the f-stop wide open to start focusing, because as soon as I advance the lever and get ready to take the shot, it's automatically already wide open. And then it'll stop down just as it's ready to take the picture. So that was their, something that they were lauding that this camera would do. And, so it was kind of a neat feature. Now, this camera also had what's called a light value scale. On the lower part right here on the shutter speed dial, there's yellow numerical values printed. And on the lens, below your f-stops, which you're not going to see, you'll see it when you see the picture of the lens, there are yellow numbers below your f-stops. So it's basically what they call divided light values. So in the old days, you might have light meters that would actually give you a numerical value. You'd have a light value scale on your light meter. You go and get your exposure, and it might say, okay, you need a light value, your light value is 11. So what you would do is you would be able to use any combination of numbers from what's on your aperture ring or your shutter speed dial, and as long as those two numbers added up to 11, you had the correct exposure. And so what you would do is, if you needed to favor shutter speed because you had a moving subject, you would make, if you were looking for 11, you might set the shutter speed to 8, to a light value of 8, and you would set your aperture to 3. So 8 plus 3 is 11. You might flip it the other way around if you wanted the best depth of field. Okay, so when you're a light value of 8 is when you're at f16. So you're going to have a lot of depth of field. A light value of 8 on your shutter speed is 1/250th of a second. A 10 is 1/1000th of a second. So you could just use any combination of numbers to get that light value, recommended light value that your exposure meter is telling you to use. Now, this was common on cameras in the 50s and the early 60s, and I think it was just trying to take the complexity away from cameras, so they didn't really have to understand so much what an aperture ring did, or it really didn't have to understand shutter speeds that much, other than, the higher the number, the better it is for action. I think they just tried to break it down to make it easier for people, especially using, exposure meters back in the day. And my mom's Kodak Pony 4 viewfinder 35 millimeter camera had that same numbering system on it. Now, of course, Minolta touted the advantage of the SR2 SLR, no longer having parallax error that you had with rangefinder cameras, because what you saw through the viewfinder is what you would get on a film negative. Of course, that's only true if your viewfinder magnification was 100%. So if it was 95%, you're seeing 95% of the image when you're looking through whereas there is some part of the image that's going to be on your negative that you can't see when you're looking through the viewfinder. But that holds true to today's cameras as well. Other advantages was you could easily see the relationship between the subject, background, and foreground. You could see the actual color looking through the viewfinder. If you put colored filters on the lens, you would see the effect when you're looking through the viewfinder. And like I said, you could see the depth of field, even though you didn't have a depth of field preview button. As long as you didn't advance the film, you could just adjust your aperture ring as you're looking through, and you could see your depth of field. Or you do have a depth of field scale on your lens, so if you've already advanced the film, you could calculate what range of focus that you have by looking at your lens after you've focused. Now, another thing was with rangefinder cameras, you were always limited to a 135 millimeter lens. You couldn't use anything longer than that. So when SLRs came out, now you could use longer telephoto lenses. Now, the manual for this camera stated it was long impossible for 35 millimeter cameras to use any wide angle lenses longer than 45 millimeters because the back of the lens would go in too far and would interfere with the mirror being able to move up and out of the way when you took the picture. So then they came out with, now this is going back in this time frame, not today's cameras, they created the RF lenses, what they call the retro focus lenses, and they eliminated that problem, so they were able to put 35 millimeter and 28 millimeter lenses on these cameras. In the manual, they showed available long telephoto lenses of a 250 millimeter f4, although that was not announced until 1959, from what I looked up. They talked about a 200 millimeter f3.5 PF lens. I don't show any record that that lens ever got made. They had a 135 millimeter f2.8 and a 100 millimeter f3.5, and they were available at the launch of the camera along with this 55 millimeter f1.8. Those were the only three lenses that came out when this first camera was introduced. They only had three lenses available. Now they got this black ring on the back of the viewfinder. You can unscrew this and take it off. And this was so that you could put other attachments on. They had an SR2 attachment, which was so that you could put it had a cold shoe so that you could mount a flash above the camera. So you would rest that on the camera, and then you would tighten this black ring, and it would secure it onto the camera with this black ring. You also had other optional accessories that we'll talk about in a little bit. The camera could use a mechanical cable release, would screw right into the shutter release button. Let's see what else we got. Shutter speeds available on this camera was bulb mode, and then 1 second to 1/1000th of a second. The SR1 that came out a year later only went to 1/500th of a second, which I mentioned earlier. The rewind lever has a very long stroke. It's 180 degrees. But you could do multiple strokes. Okay? You know how some Leica cameras, single stroke, double stroke? Well, you could do a double stroke on this. You could do the long single stroke on this. Whatever you want to do. So this film advanced lever was a very similar design to what you saw on the Leica M3s. And as I mentioned, you had separate flash sync connectors. So if you used FP for flash bulbs, you had, let's see what the sync was. You could sync with the flash bulbs with your shutter speed from 1 second to 1/1000th of a second. If you use the X sync for electronic flash, your flash sync was 1/50th of a second back in those days. There were a lot of accessories shown in the manual. How many of those were released, I don't know. They were not necessarily available when this camera came out in 1958, just like, you know, one of the lenses in the manual didn't show up until a year later. But you actually had lens adapters that you could put on this camera to allow you to use Leica lenses and Exacta lenses. You had the cable release, the neck strap, common stuff like that, but you had a microscope adapter, you had a bellows unit for close focusing, you had extension tubes that you could buy, a copy stand, a right angle finder, a magnifying attachment to put on the back of the camera, you know, filters and other accessories as well. So the camera, it was a great camera, and it was popular, but it was very expensive. Even though it was cheaper than the Canon and much cheaper than the Nikon, it was still considered too expensive by many people. So to try to get the price down and get more sales is when the following year they came out with the SR1, which was really identical to this, other than only having the 1/500th of a second maximum shutter speed. Now, what's interesting is, like I said, the SRT series came out after these, and this is the SRT 100, and this was the dumbed down version of the SRT 101. And what they took away when they came out with the SRT 100, it went where it only had 1/500th of a second shutter speed versus 1/1000th. It did not have mirror lockup, and it doesn't even have a self timer on it. And it did not display the shutter speed in the viewfinder. So that feature was taken away to create a cheaper model, to try to get more people to buy their cameras. And when you look through this display, there is no information in the display. You don't see the shutter speed. You don't know what your shutter speed is. You don't know what your f-stop is. And there's no exposure metering system in it. So you're only looking through it for composition and focusing and previewing your depth of field if you do it right. So I think this is really, for its era, was really a nice camera. And this is a good functioning example. And like I said, this plastic piece on the bottom was, I believe, most people say that was, like for an alignment pin or whatever for a motor drive that never got released. And that's it. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. So until next time, take care, enjoy life, capture some of it, and go out and get some fantastic images of your own. Like I said, irregardless of what camera you choose to use. Take care, everybody.